Hello, everyone. My name is Katie, and I'm the host of the Creative Species podcast. Although I have an art degree and work at an art museum, I am still someone who has struggled with my relationship with creativity. I'm curious about how others, whether professionally or personally, have weaved creativity into their daily lives. So, this project is a series of interviews of people around me from all different disciplines that will share their story, aspirations, opinions, hot takes, and advice. So, here we go. Hello, everyone. Today, we are talking to another educator, this time in English journalism and yearbook. And we really get into what creativity looks like in pop culture and social media, if it's still creative, if it's a cash grab in this capitalist society we're in, and also the representation of marginalized artists and creatives in education. So I first met Jason at Central Michigan University, where we both went to school and we were in the same student organization. And Jason really initiated our friendship, bringing me into his friend group. Now our group has grown, and ever since COVID starting in 2020, even though we all live in different places, we have continued a Zoom game night pretty much every month for the past 5 years. And Jason has been a big ringleader of keeping us all together. And he's just a very dear friend and so incredibly ambitious, which you'll see by his bio. Jason Westerhall is an English and journalism teacher based in the Greater Lansing area. He earned his bachelor's degree in English and he is part of the International Literacies Association's 30 Under 30 list for 2025. He is a diversity, inclusion, justice, and equity chair for the Michigan Council of Teachers of English. He primarily teaches AP language and composition, queer literature, and yearbook. He strives for education to be a liberatory process for all students. In his free time, he enjoys escape rooms, reading, video games, and more. So get ready for lots of tangents. It's kind of his thing. Here's Jason. Hello, welcome to the pod.
Hello, how are you?
I'm feeling a little bit of creatively burnt out, but that's the topic of today is creativity. And I think everyone kind of sees that a little differently. And I would like to first ask, like, how do you define creativity or how do you view it?
Yeah, so when you had approached me about doing this, that was one of the things I was thinking in the back of my head is how do I define creativity? Because, one time I had a student, I was talking to her about yearbook stuff. I don't know, it was about something. And I was like, I don't really consider myself that creative of a person. And she very instantly was like, but with all the yearbook and journalism, graphic design stuff, you don't think that's creative? And instantly I was like, no. And then I had to sit there with a second. I was like, what does that mean? And I think sometimes with like yearbook is we're helping develop a story, but it's also within a certain rule or rigid structure frame that we try to follow sometimes. That there's so many rules to follow that you're not supposed to break, and you can break the rules sometimes. That it was a little bit of struggle, but that kind of opened my eyes to be like, oh, maybe this is creative because, like you said, with being burnt out, I have not been exploring as much of the creativity as I've wanted to lately. And I think it's one of those things of like, what does it actually mean to be creative? So I was thinking about for a while, especially after you approached me, I was like, how would I define creativity? And it got to the point where I kept thinking, like, okay, people think a binary, even though binary systems don't work, you're either creative or you're not. And I was like, I don't think, I was like, if someone were to have the opposite of creativity, what is the opposite of that? And I feel like people might say logic, but I don't think logic is the opposite of creativity. But I also don't think that dullness or nothing is the opposite of creativity either. So I was really grappling with this. I was like, this feels like an existential crisis. I don't know what's going
That's
on.
a philosophical question.
I know, and those are good questions to have, and they're tough. And I think it goes to show why singular definitions are not always effective. So I did end up Googling how people define creativity, and it always has something about creating or producing new or original ideas, concepts, etc. And I was thinking about how people use creative all the time. It's like, okay, it's creative if you think outside of the box for something. It's creative if it's a visual medium, and then people say creative in a sarcastic way, which I'll get to the sarcastic way in a second. But with the visual media, I think it's people have an easier time to say, oh, look at this book cover. It's creative because it's visual art. And then when you have an out of the box solution, it's creative because it's not an A to B. But I think that's also, in a weird way, normalizing the idea that creativity is you go off the beaten path, which I think everyone should do. And that's a whole separate conversation. For me, creativity is also this expression of ideas maybe in non-traditional ways, but even then I don't like that definition because Mitch Albom, who a sports writer, sometimes you look at how he writes his sports articles and he doesn't write it under the AP style. I would say he's creative, but isn't enough to say that if you are writing like an official essay and you use a creative spin. If you do a sentence structure that's not traditional, does that mean it's all creative? I don't know. Those are questions. But the other thing I think is funny about the ironic, not ironic, but the sarcastic piece with it is there is a TikToker who I don't remember her name, but she would basically just stitch and duet cooking videos of people making interesting recipes. And she'd always be like, everybody's so creative. In theory, looks horrible. Like, I don't have an example of a food thing because I haven't watched her in a while, but I don't know. It's like, I don't know. But I just pulled up a video. I was like, what does this look like? So the first video that pulled up, they're putting an uncooked ramen and they're wrapping ground beef around it. But in theory, ground beef in a pasta, that's not too unfamiliar. So I wonder if there's more to this video. Oh, she's putting peanut butter on and Skittles. This
On,
cannot be real. This
on the
cannot be
burger
real.
and the ramen?
So she wrapped the ramen with ground beef and then she put peanut butter on it and now there's Skittles on it and now she's putting the ramen seasoning packet on it and she's grilling it.
See, I don't know. I believe everybody's creative, but like some of that stuff, it's just kind of like the why, but like also why not? So I'm conflicted about that. I also, when I was in Italy, I had a friend and he was just always like, Americans, why can't a pizza just be a pizza? Why do you have to put like
Hmm.
donuts and like a pizza donut and like all this crazy stuff? Like, why do you Americans do that when pizza's just good on its own? I'm like, I don't know.
See, but I think there's an interesting thing with that, with some of these accounts that were on TikTok or other things. Um, I think one of the questions with creativity is creativity with intent. And even, you know, one thing I think about is with artists and their messages is they may not come across one way. Oh, great example. When I was in college, we had to do this project where we had to like record ourselves reenacting King Lear. And with the amount of characters in the scene, there was one more of us than there were characters. So to be fair, we just split up King Lear just for the sake of the project. And then our professor was like, so you made him crazy by doing that. And we all stood up there like, what? And then we were like, that was not our intent. We quite literally, and he thought we were nervous to talk, but we like, had never even considered that's how it was going to be taken away. And we were just kind of like, we just split it up because there weren't enough of us to fill every role. We wanted to give each person an equal shot at being in this video. But that was a lesson. An unintended consequence is we made King Lear's characterization appear more crazy in the way we did this for a project. But when people make recipes with like the pizza and stuff, I think there are times where like you want to try making food just to see how it is, right? So honestly, peanut butter on a burger is not crazy. There it's very common to have a burger with peanut butter. There is a peanut butter and jelly burger at this restaurant in downtown Lansing that I love to get all the time. But anyways, that's not the point. But I think sometimes with those videos, once you get the Skittles and the seasoning, they're making it to be a troll. So then it's this question is trolling creativity? And I think yes, but I think that's where the intentionality can challenge the definition of creativity because there absolutely are recipes that people are going to make because they want to see what the taste flavor is like and they want to be creative in it and have something new. But then there's people doing it because they want to be a troll and just to get clicks and views. And I think that intentionality makes the creativity different, but I don't know. I have a hard time saying it's not creative because, hey, you have found a niche to get yourself out there. Maybe that is creative. But there's also people who just like will do nothing, sit here, stare at the screen, and they get views. That's literally what they do.
So is there a hierarchy? So if you think our TikTok create, I mean, we call them creators, our
Ooh,
TikTok creators, our content creators, creatives, as a broad speaking of artistic people, are they creatives? And is there a hierarchy among them?
I just walked myself right into that hole, didn't I? I don't want to be someone who says we should have a hierarchy because I don't think that's fair to artists, right? Because there's different purposes for each of it. Like, even if we think of fashion shows, they are not meant to wear on a day-to-day basis. They are an art piece that you're wearing. Like, I'm gonna go and wear this every day. Am I gonna wear this on at New York Fashion Week? Oh my God, no. But it's like a place and occasion. So when it comes to TikTok creators and everything they do, I don't think there is necessarily a hierarchy, but there is a level of skill I think that can differentiate it. And I think that's different. It's like when people do cuts and edits, that's a hard skill to learn. To be able, as I said before, to wrap ground beef around ramen noodles and put random stuff on it, on a technicality with the flavor profiles, it might make sense to do it. Like to balance the bitter flavors with sweet, whatever it may be. It might make sense, but I don't want to say that one is more valuable than the other because I feel bad saying it.
It's like having some sort of entertainment value, I guess, for somebody because if they're being successful at that, but there's like the loss of that intent and effort versus if someone is uh doing it, coming up with the choreography and dancing, and then editing
Hmm.
that piece. So I think we can tell the difference, but then I feel like if you apply the same logic to, say, artwork, and you have some artwork that is super realistic and you can tell that they have the skill to do that. And then, someone might look at something that's more like avant-garde or a performance piece where maybe it is just there's one artwork at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the video of a woman holding a bowl of milk. Tries to hold it up and it's like 7 minutes long and she starts shaking and the milk starts to spill. And yes, there's some it is intentional and there's some symbolism with femininity and everything in there. But when you compare those two pieces, it's like, oh, like the effort and the skill of this realistic painting from 1505, like that's better art. Like how can you compare?
Hmm.
I feel like if I apply the same logic to like TikTok, like I don't know, like maybe is there something more to the person just sitting there and I'm just not seeing it? Like is there value there? I don't know.
Right. And I think there's a lot of questions that plays into the way in which media is shared. Because when you said about that replication, like there's stuff out there about people who try to replicate Rothko's paintings and even, and they can't do it in the same way. Like they think it's so easy to, in theory, it's simple. If you look at the paintings that are just a few colors and stripes, whether God, there's a three stripe horizontal piece, I think, by him. But that coloration is so specific. And with that intentionality and everything, I think that is an interesting thing to think about, like art and creativity in the sense of, is that something we are able to do? And I think people put more, I don't even want to say that, I don't know. It's a tough question. I think maybe sometimes people place a value on things that are more difficult to achieve, but also with people who are successful for, I don't want to say doing the bare minimum, but there's certain elements at play, right? Like I won't get into the politics of it, but sometimes if you're attractive, you're gonna get famous quicker than other people. There is a TED Talk by Natalie Tran, who on YouTube was known as Community Channel, and she is so funny to me. And she did this like fake TED Talk. She went to talk to a university, and I think it was her. I don't. I might be making this up now because I haven't seen it in a while. But I feel like she talked about how she felt a need to be funny as an Asian woman. There's this like need to be funny in spaces where you don't have representation. And America Ferrera's TED Talk, this she did a TED Talk about how her identity is a superpower. And I've seen so many TED Talks where people are so serious and they love it. But especially she's talking about her identity as a Latina, as a woman. And I started looking at all of these different TED Talks and comparing them. I'm like, people in marginalized groups are always using humor to connect to the audience in specific ways. So it's like this added pressure on us that, I am fat, I am a queer person. There is this like pressure sometimes to be funny or to do something because seriousness may not always work for me. So when people are successful because they're conventionally attractive and they're skinny and they're white, but they're not funny, they have all these followers. And that's also not me complaining, being like, oh, they don't care about us fat queer people. It's just it's always this notion that people in marginalized communities have to work so much harder to get the same level of success for mediocrity from straight cis white people. No offense. So,
As you
anyways,
finish the humor.
yes.
Well, with that, we'll take a short break and then I'd love to hear your hot takes.
All right, sounds good. So I am a yearbook teacher, and that is one of my favorite things I get to do. It is the most amount of work, probably one of the most stressful things of my job, because we are a program that competes nationally. So this is no offense to other schools, yearbooks and stuff. Even when I was in yearbook in high school, our yearbook was not to the caliber of what the school I teach at publishes. Some yearbooks are just hokey pokey. Here's a photo collage. Let's go with it. But we try to do a lot of journalistic yearbook stuff. And with that, I think a lot about design, typography, all sorts of things. And one thing, and it might be irrational, but the one design trend that I really do not like is not capitalizing letters in logos, designs, etc. I am not a fan of the all lowercase design.
Interesting. Do you think that's like
Mhm.
also the partially English teacher in you?
I don't think it's the English teacher in me, because when it comes to English, I'm very much like, grammar is a social construct. How you go about writing things is different, right? Especially if you look at poetry, there's so many ways to go about poetry, and you don't have to capitalize everything and it has to be done with a purpose. I feel most of the time the lowercase typography is not really done with a purpose. It's just like it's trendy, but does it really make sense for what you are trying to do? And I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think that's something that I try to tell my students when I'm just teaching art is that not to be quirky for the sense of being quirky or just doing something, oh, just because you have to have some sort of reason or choice behind or reason why you're making those choices in your artwork.
Exactly. And that's what I think about that too, is like it has to make sense in, excuse me, the broader scheme of things. And I think a lot of people will just take on a trend and go with it, and it doesn't like quite make sense. And then, aside from that, I won't get into too much of a tangent about this. I will also say breaking the mold with creative responses can be challenging as well. And so that's, another creative qualm I have is when institutions or I don't know if institutions is the right word, but institutions kind of like try to gatekeep or prevent you from exploring new things. Like we went to a yearbook thing months and months ago, and one of the things we were trying to explore are like all sorts of different, God, I don't remember exactly. I will admit, one of my editors in chief is a much better artist than I am. You've met her before. Well, you've seen her before because she also won my humanitarian symposium. She does all this great artwork, and I don't remember how she phrased it, but she was trying to do a lot of like non typical shapes in yearbooks. And we got a lot of pushback, and they were like, don't do this. And then one of the speakers at this place we were at, they're like, oh, all these other design places are doing it, but yearbooks haven't done it yet. So I was like, okay, so we're saying we could be a group to try to do it for the first time, but they're still like very much pushing against it. So I think the institutionalized way of going about creativity can be a hindrance.
And I think that going back to, creativity to me, how I kind of define that is, out of the box thinking a little bit. And I think that sometimes,
Hmm.
like the people you're working with at this conference, they're so trained in maybe traditional ways or trained in this is how it's supposed to be, is that your view becomes a little bit more limited. Like you maybe grow that skill set but you become more convicted in yeah how things should be. And so when other people who might not be as necessarily skilled, quote unquote, makes
Hmm.
them a little bit more uninhibited, and so when they try new things, it's sometimes it can get to a more creative solution because they are not so maybe boxed in by education in that subject.
Yeah, and one of the things I think about too is when I got my master's degree, God, one of the classes I took, I think it was called The Ways of Seeing, or maybe that's the name of the book I had to read. I don't
Yeah,
know
by
if it was.
Burger.
Yeah, and maybe I think the class might have been called the same thing. And I remember we talked about, if you really think about it, art has always been, you're taking, not that it's like exact replicas, but you're pulling inspiration from other things and looking at techniques of the people who came before you. And yes, you can model it into your own whatever, but is anything ever necessarily new? That is a whole other debate.
So I guess how are you okay, firstly, are you familiar with Sir Ken Robinson's Do Kills Creativity TED Talk?
Yes, I am.
The most watched TED Talk ever.
Oh,
Um,
is it really? Okay.
yeah. Do schools kill creativity? And I'm wondering that, but also in that TED Talk, it also mentions how everybody is born creative and that we get either grown out of it or educated out of it, as he says. And so I guess I'm wondering how do you I guess, teach creativity, but like I said, I don't know if that's the right question, or like how do you create an environment of creativity and how that might differ from yearbook versus you're also teaching AP English and also journalism and how that just looks differently.
What a great question. I have not watched that TED Talk in a while. Well, I have students who ask about it because for AP Lang, I have them do an evidence database assignment that I assign them 6 months ahead of time. So every 2 months, they have a certain number of things to watch, read, listen to, etc. And I think a couple of students were listening to that TED Talk about if schools kill creativity, or he's got another TED Talk he has. So maybe they were doing that. But when it comes to education, and I think the system, any systems in general, with creativity, I think we all have the ability to be creative. And in the nicest way possible, but I don't know how I want to phrase it. Education is, in a sense, of crisis. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. I also don't want it to be so fearful that people think we are doomed and, there's no hope for us in whatever it may be. Um, but I think about all the things that are going on, right? We have a rising literacy crisis. People do not read. And I'm not just talking about reading fiction books, right? They're not reading any kinds of books. They're not reading articles. They're not doing anything. Visual media, which is great, it is inherently great. I'm not going to decry visual media. That is oftentimes the only thing people consume. So it's speaking and listening. And I struggle with it because if you think back to the earliest parts of our histories, that is our earliest part of our histories. It's the oral tradition. Um, So I'm trying to, in my head, balance what that is. Because when I read a lot of scholarship on literacy, there's a lot of scholars who will emphasize that there's hope in our literacy crisis because we're able to demonstrate that people are able to read the world. And that is a broader definition of literacy, right? It's your ability to read, which doesn't physically mean you are transcribing words or letters that make words, that make sentences into your brain and comprehending them. But I think there is something to say about some of these skills that develop our brain in other ways. And that reading and writing is an important element just as much as the visual arts and writing or listening and speaking. Um, I'm very good at speaking, apparently. So I think about that, but for schools, like especially American schools, I think about those crises, and I think about test scores being a struggle. I think about apathy. I think about how students oftentimes do not want to do things. Um, and it all comes together. But in particular with AP Lang, I will say this. I made the decision last year that I was going to go gradeless. And yeah, I'm using an ungrading method. So essentially, without getting into too many details on it, everything is out of 2 points. Students are focusing on goals, they're focusing on growth, they're focusing on certain things instead of trying to fit into this particular rubric to get an A. Because truthfully, last year, first trimester, and if any of my students listen to this, and I've told them this before, I was so irritated with the amount of them who are like, I need an A. I have to get it. What can I do? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you have to take the feedback that I give you and apply it. And it's not you just, you get a paper, you revise it because I let them revise for a higher grade, and then you move on. You have to be able to apply that feedback every single assignment afterwards, right? It's just like what an athlete does. You keep practicing and practicing and practicing. You get to the game. All of what comes before you comes into fruition in that game. You have to do the same in academia. And another reason I went with this ungrading method is I was like, I'm tired of you asking me how you should go about writing something or approaching this project. Just try something. And that ungrading method seems to have helped a lot, where I think people have been trying to approach more creative things, and some of them are not as concerned with the grammatical structure or the syntax, which is something, I do want them to focus on. But by removing this barrier of having them think so rigidly about a rubric, I think it's freed their minds a little bit to try things that they otherwise would not. And that's where I think some of the issues are, is mostly in the grading system that kills creativity. And I wish I knew all the ways to fix that. But I think that is a major barrier for them.
Yeah. And I mean, I resonate with a lot of that too because I was that student. I was that student that was like, how do I get an A? And I feel like, I mean, it doesn't matter what subject it was, I would just do whatever I needed to do and then do the test or whatever it was, do the paper, and then all the information that whatever I was supposed to learn left my body, and that was it. That was the goal. And I feel like that kind of thinking, I think, carried me over into my art courses. So I have a degree in art, and I think that when I was in college doing all my art assignments, that also became the goal. Like I feel like I wanted an A because I wanted to get a good GPA, and I think it got to a point where I was maybe making artwork to please my professor and not
Mm.
I think I did do a lot of risk taking. I mean, I think I did a lot of different things that my other students necessarily weren't doing. So I don't know that was so much it, but I feel like I was making work that maybe was similar to my professors, or maybe I would have done something a little differently. I don't know if that, if that makes sense, but I think I was doing that in my art classes too.
Yeah, and I think that happens, and it depends on the kind of teacher you have. I think my students know, for the most part, they know that I'm not, my goal is to grade them on content, grade them on skill to a certain extent. I'm not an I mean, I'm yearbook, so like I guess I'm an art teacher kind of. So I'm grading them on skill, but we're thinking about the parameters that are there and thinking about how they're I think about there was a particular yearbook page without naming the names of the students or what exactly it's about. Technically, with some of the rules that yearbook organizations want us to have, it technically breaks those rules. And I said to our yearbook reps, I was like, so they're doing these things, but that's typically not what we would do. Like, they're okay, I'll give you an example. So in current yearbook competitions. You are not supposed to have, like, if you have one text box, they don't want you to have more than three captions in the same text box. So we have a page that has more than three, but just based on how the page goes and how it's designed, it makes sense with the design and breaks the rules with the purpose. So that's what I mean with that is like when you know the rules, you can also know when to break them and when it makes sense. And that goes back to the typography thing. I think people don't they're trendy, but they don't understand why it works for there's times it works, times it doesn't. But you are absolutely right. And I think that's an issue with education is we are so stressed on getting an A that we're not thinking about what it takes there. And there's so much discourse out there in the education world. There's one, I haven't read it yet, but I have it saved. I think it's from the Atlantic. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But it's about how, you don't deserve an A just for attempting or doing the minimum. Something like that. And I think that's an interesting thing. But anyways, to go back to the original point, sometimes kids do have teachers where they don't know how to approach it because they know their teacher may have a particular perspective and they don't want to, take that risk because they're like, I want to do something that will appease my teacher. And I've had so many times students have written about things that I do not care about. I have no personal interest in it. I don't agree with them, and they still get A's because I'm not judging if I agree with you or not. And sometimes I'm not gonna like lie. Sometimes there's one student in particular, I don't want to say what the topic was, um, wrote a wonderful investigative journalistic piece. I agreed with or disagreed with so much of what she said, but she used the evidence correctly. She had good control of language. She did everything a journalist is supposed to do. I can't fault her on it. That was a piece of quality journalism. Do I agree with her? No. She did everything right, though.
And that's what's hard, I think, about grading like art, right? I guess you may, or
Hmm.
a creative thing or writing can be a little bit subjective, and so I don't know, it's hard to grade things that you don't agree with.
Right. And that's why, especially with an ungrading system, if you can, like, a lot of it is reflection and growth. So if students can demonstrate how they're growing or how they're reflecting or how they're thinking about things, because maybe sometimes is they tried something and it didn't work. And that's okay. But if they have that metacognition about it, that's totally, totally fine. I mean, I was writing a poem a few weeks ago. There's this poetry project I've tried to do for 4 years, and it's just I've never followed through. It's never worked, and it's failed again this year. But anyways, I sat there for a half an hour thinking about like one word, and eventually I changed it. But then afterwards, I was looking at this. I was like, "There's something about this that isn't my favorite," but I tried it. It's not perfect, but that's okay.
I mean, that's always perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And I think especially with
Right.
like my biggest thing where I've kind of basically stopped making art post college just because I don't know. I feel like yeah, if it's not going to be good, why would I even attempt to do it? Which it's not the way it should be. I feel like creativity
Right.
should be about play. Have a background in art. There's this extra pressure for, and you
Yes.
English some extra pressure. Like this has to be good because like I studied this.
Yeah, and I think with that, we are our worst critics. We can look at something and see mistakes. Like I'll look at old yearbooks and look at stuff that I did not like, but other people do. And, but I was there for the process of what was going on. And I think that's the thing with it. But anyways, I found a poem and I was looking at it. I wrote it, but I looked at it. I was like, this is really good. What is this? And I like didn't believe that I wrote it and started Googling it to be like, did I just like copy and paste this or like write this down from somewhere? So it's like one of those things that sometimes you put something away and, I was thinking it was like, wow, I would have written that like 8 years ago, and that's crazy.
Yeah, because on a personal note, because you talked a little about like your students and everything and about teaching, but for your own creativity, your own artistry, if that's writing or whatever it is, like how do you feel like that has changed throughout your life? Because I feel similarly. I look at stuff that I made when I was 18, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I couldn't do this now. Like this is
Hmm.
amazing. I don't know if I thought that at the time when I actually made it, but part of me is feels like, did I lose some of my creativity? Did I lose some of my skill of that I had when I was younger? Or maybe it's just hindsight 2020, or maybe it's just like a bigger part of my life. But how has it changed for you since like maybe from high school?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, what I tell my students in AP Lang in particular is the way you get better at writing is you have to be reading and writing more often, and you have to do it regularly. So I think sometimes when I write more creative stuff, that's where I feel I've lost. I don't want to say I've lost my capability because it's still within me. I still have the creativity that's there. I'm just not in the habit of doing it. And I think that's the key difference is, and maybe you feel the same way in high school, in college, you were creating a lot more art regularly, um, in ways or doing it in ways for your own view, if that makes sense. Because when I think about me as a teacher, and you're in a similar role as well, where you do a lot of education stuff, on a technicality, I teach creativity in a lot of ways. I'm not the one making it all the time. So I think that's where it's a little bit lost. Like, yes, I'm helping produce this yearbook. I'm not the one making it. I'm teaching them how to do it, but I'm not in the process of doing it. So even when I think about, even when I was in elementary school, the one thing I wanted to do was be an author. I wanted to write and whatever it is. And I do a lot of writing, but I feel like I do so much nonfiction research kind of writing now that not that that creativity is totally gone, but I think because I'm not in the habit of doing that kind of writing, it's escaped me a little bit and I have to get it back. And that's true for anything. I mean, I took 5 years of German. I can't do that anymore. Like I haven't done it in so long and I would like to find ways to bring it back, but I just have to get in the process of doing it again. Um, and even when I, got my master's, which is accidentally 1/3 in art, it wasn't a whole lot of creating art. It was talking about art. It was analyzing art, and that's very different from making art.
Yeah, I mean, it is different. I think it's different. I mean, because one is, yeah, you're expressing yourself versus you're analyzing someone else's artwork. But I think it's important to do both, right?
Yes.
Because that's what when I have art students come to the museum, and most of the field trip is we're analyzing other people's artwork. But what I try to tell them is by having this critical eye about what other people are making. I mean, not like in the judgmental sense of like, because it's better to make art than it to be, so afraid it's gonna be bad or whatever, like with judgment. But going in and looking at art and thinking, what is the artist trying to say? Is that clear? What choices are they making? Then that'll help them make their own art. And so I think it is important to do both. And I think it's good for an everyday person also to experience making art. Once again, it doesn't have to be good. They don't have to be good at it, but I think it's good for the soul for anybody to just make art, go to a museum, go to a play, do both of those things for quality.
Hmm.
However,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say I agree with that because that's kind of like the tension or tandem that you've got to deal with is like so I have like an art piece I'm thinking about, not that I, create a whole lot of art that's outside of writing, but I have like an idea that stemmed from going to Art Prize in Grand Rapids and looking at some of my favorite pieces there. And I was thinking about like, if I was thinking about this message, how would I sort of like convey it in particular, right? Because a lot of art can convey similar messages. I'm not going to subscribe to Oscar Wilde's aesthetic theory, art for art's sake, yada, yada, yada. I don't know if he's ever admitted he knows that that cannot 100% work because he said himself that with Dorian Gray, his regret is that he wrote it with a moral. So it just comes out of art naturally, often. What was I saying about this? Oh, so Noah, my husband, just read the graphic novel version of Handmaid's Tale, and art is also political. that's not what this tangent is about. But like Margaret Atwood is writing about a fascist regime and what it's like to lose rights. And she's not the only author to do it, but she has constructed her story creatively in such a way that it is distinctively hers, and she's talking about the same topics in so many other ways. So anyways, to go back to the point, like analyzing artwork, it's important to see what does Margaret how does Margaret Atwood tackle this? How does Octavia Butler tackle this? How does even Suzanne nope. Oh my God. Hunger Games. Suzanne Collins,
I
is she
never
in
read
Hunger Games?
names.
So who wrote who wrote Twilight? Stephanie Meyer. Okay, so it is Suzanne Collins. It is Suzanne Collins. Like she's writing about this dystopian future, but it's very much rooted in these like real life things. And I think it's, all these art pieces talk about different topics, and part of art is sharing your own perspective on it, in whatever way it is. So analyzing art is important because it helps you think about how you would approach these topics. But it's important, even if it's the worst thing ever, do it. And I think that's what people have such a problem with is like, it's not even about perfection. Well, it is about perfection, but I'm like, who cares? You wrote a horrible poem. You wrote a horrible song. Who cares? It's not going to the public. But I think social media oh my God, I'm all over the place now. That's a whole other thing because I think about like Rebecca Black, Friday,
Uh-huh.
horrible song, kind of got duped into this whole process because there was a company, which in theory, that's an amazing thing for kids. You pay, I think she only paid $1,000, not an astronomical amount of money to have a song, record it, shoot a music video with your friends. That's fun.
Yes, for
She
sure. And I
got
she didn't
she
mean for it to. It was just supposed to be a fun little thing, and
Yes, but
became a meme.
she is a talented singer. She's got some bop. She has some good vocals that are out there, but it's one of those things is we're so focused on this pressure and it can really dismantle us. And that being vulnerable is something that I don't think we're very good at doing.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So you look at all these, say, well, anybody, but specifically, I'm thinking about, artistic reality shows. So I'm thinking RuPaul's Drag Race or Ink Master, all those cooking shows and things, right? That I think we enjoy them because we put ourselves in the judging seat, and then suddenly we're an expert in that art form. So we're looking at, like I said, I'm looking at Ink Master. That's something that me and my boyfriend watch or used to watch pretty often. Yeah, I'm an artist and I can say something about the artistic talent of it, maybe, but like I don't know anything about tattoos. And here I am being, just roasting people, and it's just who am I, and that's the thing that it makes us feel maybe more powerful. And so that's why it can be scary to put your stuff out there because you are afraid of that backlash. But at the same time, like who are these people coming at you? Because they're not doing it. So
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. Extra element of like people judging your work can be intimidating. Because I think when people go on those shows, like when they deal with the judges, that's one thing, but to deal with the public, that is a totally different thing. And I think it's one thing if people like approach you in public and talk about things, social media just has changed the landscape of it for sure.
definitely. And I feel a little hypocritical now because at the beginning of this little recording, I'm like, what are your hot takes about judging other people's stuff? But
But
go ahead.
I think that's like a personal thing because I think, when I watch Dragula, they always say, I have some qualms with that show. Actually, let me tell you, I'm going to tell you a hot take right now. On Dragula, the contestants for this past season, the winner, Asia Consent, wonderful. She did amazing. We love trans representation. We love Dragula for the most part. But they part of Dragula is it was meant to be this like punk rock underground version. And because of that, they try to emphasize or like put on this facade that all the artists there create all of their looks. And that's not even remotely true. They get other people to design the looks for them all the time. And it was like, I don't know if it was, it must have been in the contract because they didn't do it. When they would post their looks on Instagram or other social media platforms, they were not allowed to give recognition on those posts to the artists that created those looks. That is, and I think that's where it gets really bad because it's one thing to say, um, you don't like something. It's another to not be able to give credit to the artist for the art to speak on itself. Because I'm also not sitting here being like, there was an episode of Drag Race a couple days ago. I'm not here trying to be like too negative about like, oh, this one girl in particular hated her look, blah 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 blah. But when it goes back to the typography, I'm not calling out any particular business that does it. It's just it's not something I inherently like, but that doesn't mean it's bad.
Right.
And I think that's something as well. Like there is I don't know if I want to say it. I might get canceled. There was a look from Drag Race season 16. I'll say it. I don't know. This is like oh my God, this is so hard because like it's one of those things where it's like I don't want to bring any negativity to like the creator stuff. I love Dawn. Dawn is a drag queen on season 16. Love her. There was a outfit she made for one of the design challenges that was just not my favorite. And it didn't resonate with me. Everyone lost their minds because of how good it was and they liked it. And I will admit it's constructed well. There's certain elements of it that are good. There's just something about it I don't like. But I'm also not on social media. Well, I guess I'm on this podcast now, but I'm not constantly like, I hated the thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Why was she in the top? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that's what they're doing to Anya Nerve. Her name's Anya Nerve this season for Drag Race. They're doing that. A lot of people are doing that to her, being like, well, she accessorized it good, but her dress was not made well. I'm like, oh my God, whatever. Like, why are we having this fight? Like, I think I'm gonna totally misquote this. But Shea Coulee on one of the Drag Race seasons quoted a different designer or someone, or maybe she was quoting herself. I don't know. And she said, "There's two people that are important when you're thinking about like art. It for you." It matters how it makes you feel and how it makes other people feel. And if art makes, that feeling is important. I went on a tangent I didn't mean to because I also feel really bad for even saying that about Dawn's look, but
It's okay, but I think, like I said, I think it's good to recognize, it can be other people can find it good and there's other things good in it, but it's not be your cup of,
right.
and
And
I think,
maybe I was just gonna say real quick, maybe a better example of this too is like, because I could say this, well, I could say Dawn's objectively. Mitch Albom, who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie, Five People You Meet in Heaven, et cetera, et cetera. Love those books. The one book that I read of his, oh God, what was it? One More Person You Meet in Heaven. It's like the sequel to the Five People You Meet in Heaven, and I don't want to like spoil anything. It was a cute story. I didn't like it, but also like the reason I didn't like it is I'm not his target audience. Like if you read the Five People You Meet in Heaven, like there's a lot of spirituality stuff in there, which is great. But it's also written in such a way, because Mitch Albom, by the way, fantastic writer. He really is. Um, it's written in a way that it transcends audiences. There's a lot of like good stuff in there. But this other sequel book, it's very explicitly written for people who are very spiritual and maybe probably of the Christian faith and stuff. And that's not me. That is not, but it's a great book. It's not for me. And because, you know, I'm not the target audience with that, it didn't resonate with me, and that's okay.
right. And I think with that, I have a hot take.
Okay,
You're gonna be really
let's
mad.
hear it.
I thought Wicked was just okay.
Oh, but see, we've talked about this, and people have said this as well, but I feel like there's two sorts. I feel like I'm mansplaining, and I'm not trying to do that right now. I
Okay,
feel like
call me in
there's,
your Wicked shirt. Let's go. Tell me.
yes, yes. I feel like there's two types of people who consistently do not, I don't want to say that you all dislike Wicked, but there's two people who like, two groups of people I've noticed that have more critiques for it than others. And one, I think it's people who are a little bit more in tune with musicals like you. And I think that's a totally fair critique. You've seen Wicked on Broadway, and I think those critiques, not that. I feel bad saying it's more valid, but it's a trend I'm noticing, right? People who have seen things more like that, and then people who just musical theater is not for them and they want to hate on it. And that's a separate conversation. Like I have students who do not like Wicked. eh, Well, they say they don't like it, but they have no intent on seeing, they have no interest in it, so they're going to hate on it. That's fine. But I think there are fair critiques for the movie. I love it. I don't think that's too much of a hot take, but nor am I.
I think my problem with it is just that I mean, I think it was beautiful. I think the actresses did a phenomenal job. I'm actually not really another hot take much of an Ariana Grande fan, but I think she was the right person for that role,
Oh
100%.
yeah.
But so it's very well casted. And I think my biggest problem with it is that I wish, because I feel like if they can do the Broadway musical in like one sitting, I feel like they should be able to do somewhat of a movie in one setting. So I guess my biggest problem is that it's being split up into part one, part two. I
Hmm.
think that, I mean, of course, you don't want things to feel rushed because I think that's a lot of the problems when you go from a lot of times you see like book to film, a lot of it feels kind of rush. And but I don't know. I just feel like to me, it feels more of like a money grab choice, not a creative choice.
And I think that's interesting too because part of the creative choices with it is I understand they're referencing more stuff in the book potentially with it. Because I actually thought with someone who has not seen Wicked since before the movie, um, I felt that the pacing actually worked for me. But I do know the original play is like 2 hours, and that's Act One and Act Two, and the Wicked movie is only Act One. But I don't know if Harry Potter was the first movie to do it. Um, J.K. Rowling sucks. I'm going to throw that out there right now. I will say that. But sorry, I'm going to say sorry, not sorry. But I think they were the first big franchise to like split their final book into two movies because they did it and then Hunger Games did it. And it is like a money cash grab, which maybe goes to show. And I think that's part of the tension that thinks about creativity is this conflict between art. We live in capitalism. We live in a capitalist society, and people are so focused on like we need money. And I agree. I'm a teacher. I have a teacher salary. I don't make good money. I took a pay cut to come to the district I work at by like $10,000. Like, there are certain things I sacrificed to come here. And unfortunately, one of those things is financial compensation. And that is a struggle when so much is going on and it sucks because, but it's also, I'm not here to like be upset with people in the movie making money off of it either. Because one of the things that happened, I don't know if you know this. So there were rumors going around that Ariana Grande made a lot more money than Cynthia Erivo. And then it came out weeks later because Ariana Grande has more like mainstream success. Cynthia, Broadway legend, love it. Ariana was on Broadway in children's media, in adult media, like more global. And then it came out that Ariana like helped negotiate for them to get the same wages on that set. So it's one of those, it's also empowering to say that typically a movie studio, and I don't know how those negotiations went. I don't think that information is out there. Maybe it is. I'd be interested in reading it. Um, but sometimes, it's hard to negotiate, and so many times people don't come together for that, and movie studios will just say, if you're not taking this, we'll move on to the next person. And it does happen. So I want to like commend them for that too, but also splitting the movie, I agree with you, into two parts. Like what it is a cash grab in a certain extent. Um, and they want to tell so much of the story, and I don't know how to balance that because capitalism is bad.
And with that, let's take a break.
Okay.
We're back. So we ended with capitalism is bad and talked a little bit about just different things in the media. I know we got a little on a tangent, but I think naturally that's what we do, and that's something that we're both kind of passionate about. So kind of
Hmm.
circling back to education. And I think that's something I appreciate about you when you talk about your classes. I think you use a lot of media examples in the classroom. And I think you did mention this at the beginning too, where students get to choose listening to different podcasts or different shows and kind of analyzing those things. And also, especially in journalism, being able to critique those things and the sources they come
Mhm.
from. And I know, and I'm very happy I got to attend, but I know that you also put together a symposium this last year for the first time that was inspired by your own education. And I think that was a great way to kind of combine all those things. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes, of course. So for AP Lang in particular, when I was in high school, I took international baccalaureate classes, which are similar to AP. And I will say one time where I student taught, one of my mentor teachers, because I student taught in English and history, one of my mentor teachers, um, the way they have their advanced courses structured is for some of the classes he ended up I think he ended up teaching it, but you have an AP psychology and you have an IB psychology. And the way he interpreted it was so they take the same class, but they choose what exam they want to take. And part of the issue is AP gets you more specific credit at different colleges and universities. But in my personal opinion, I think IB really forces you to be a more well-rounded, critical kind of analysis person. And the way my mentor teacher described it to me, because he had to prepare stuff for both AP and IB, so they would be ready for the exam no matter what they take, is I felt that AP is wants to test you on what you do not know, and IB wants to test you on what you do know. And as someone who teaches AP, I think there's an element of truth to it. Um, because, and I don't remember for sure, but I feel like when I took the IB exam and I was talking about literature, I had to write about a piece and I could go about it in whatever way I want to, where AP is more specific of you have to write about this topic and how it does something. So you're a little bit more limited. Whereas, AP, I don't know. I think there's a lot of creativity allowed in IB. So one of the things my high school English teacher did is she put on this humanitarian symposium, and it was part of IB literature. And essentially, we answered when I did it, we had to write a paper, and it could be there were no guidelines, just answer these two questions. There's some minimum stuff we had to include, like you have to include this many books or this many movies, whatever. And we had to answer the questions, what is the human worth, and how do you increase the worth of those around you? And that teacher is still like one of my biggest inspirations to this day. And she did that. There was also, she had a half day thing where my IB class, the other IB class, and her AP Lit class got to like battle each other in this blend of Survivor, Mole, Big Brother, etc. for a half day thing based on a reading of The Handmaid's Tale, which, side note, I know this is a little bit of a tangent as well. I think back to that day as a closeted queer kid, that we were down to like the final seven, and we knew that a big thing of Handmaid's Tale is talking about the women's right movements, talking about feminism, and we had to choose who to get rid of, and there were other women in the group who were like, we have to keep Jason. He knows the most about feminism and stuff. And when I look back on that, I was like, I should not have stayed in that group. Um, Comparatively, like, why are you choosing the man instead of all of the women in the group? But whatever. So just a little funny thing to look back on. But anyways, point being, so with the symposium, a bunch of people read the panel, and you were on my panel for it last year. So we had six of us total reading it, I think. Yeah, six of us, including me. And we narrowed it down to a top six. My students answer the same questions, and when we get it to the top five or six or however many,
They all had to write a paper, right? We were all reading the paper
yes.
based on that question.
Yep. And we narrowed it down, and then they got to turn their presentations into a um sort of like a TED Talk presentation, and they got to speak about it at the symposium and with the opportunity to win a scholarship. And the two winners, and it's it's out of the news, so I can say it. Ellery Curtis and Delaney Hengesbach won. And Ellery wrote a very theoretical piece about art, using the framework of the artist whose name is escaping me right now.
Rothko.
Rothko. Um, used Compared Rothko to Greek mythology and looked at how we can use this in a theoretical sense, how we can talk about human worth in a theoretical sense. And then
I think
Delaney,
she also talked, because from my experience, just to go back about reading all these papers, I feel
mhm,
like a lot of them came to the same conclusions of like human worth that's like impossible really to measure, and we're all worth something because of A, B, and C. But I think the ones that we chose, I think there were four, there five.
there were six.
There were six
Hmm.
going to the top to do their presentations. And I think the reason that we were able to narrow down those six, because I think the way that they presented the information was in the most, well, creative, like a creative narrative that was either very personal or just the way they went about it. And I think what I appreciated about Ellery and the art, I mean, the question that she also asks is, with art, when you're back to capitalism, you're selling your art at a certain price. And so how do we assign value to a piece of artwork
Hmm.
same way? And comparing that, how do we assign value to a person?
Yes, and that's exactly what you said is correct because all the essays, most of them pretty much were, it's impossible to do this, yada, yada, yada. But Ellery's is one of those that is so creative in understanding those perspectives. It's a little bit more nuanced. It's not just, it's hard to understand it, it had a very specific line of reasoning with it, which I appreciated it. And same with Delaney's. In one line, I'm gonna butcher the exact verbiage. She wrote about her grandma who is suffering from dementia, and one of the lines, roughly that I remember she wrote was how something about how your worth continues when everything you've known is lost. Something along those lines. And that line hit really hard because that is a question of like thinking about grief, thinking about memory. And it was such an interesting perspective. And all the other students who were there had different unique perspectives with it, right? One wrote about the game of life, used an analogy with that. And I told her and I gave her feedback. I was like, when I first saw you were doing this, I thought this would be a cliche, but it was actually really enamoring. And she wrote about her brother, and what he goes through and how, you know, life isn't always fair and it's the game of life is not set up for everyone to succeed. And what does that look like? Someone else wrote about failure. Someone else wrote, essentially, he kind of wrote about identity and how it shifts over time. He did a lot of pop culture analysis. So he was very good with examples. And then the last one wrote about, she wrote about Indigenous culture and how Indigenous stories can help shape our future. So they found a particular perspective that was really interesting with that. And it was one of my favorite things I ever got to do. And of course, I got, thanks to Pam's Pantry, I got them a scholarship, the top two a scholarship. And we had an art component. I collaborated with the art department, where they got to create artwork based on human worth as well, answering the same questions. So they had their artwork presented all around the stage and had a little blurb about it. So I'm very excited. We're doing it again this year. We are doing it this next week, and I believe the art classes have already introduced it as well. And we're still going to continue it with the scholarship and all these other things. And it's always really interesting to see what they come up with. So, anyways, Humanitarian Symposium. Really great, really creative. I love seeing what they do, and I'm very excited to see what they do this year. I'm changing the second question a little bit this year. I'm pulling it up because I don't remember exactly what it is, but I think it's okay. Let's see, 24, 25. How can you uplift the worth of others, if at all? That's how we're changing the second question because a lot of some of the students felt the second question, how do you increase the worth of those around you? They struggled with it. So then we kind of talked and agreed on the second question because if we're talking about human worth, then how do you do that to uplift people? And they thought that was a more important message to take away.
Yes, for sure. And I will say from my experience of being one of the graders of the papers and narrowing it down, and also I got to see the presentations and also be a judge of the artwork. It was just really cool to see that like expressing art through like critical thought. And
Hmm.
I think that that's why I mean, that's why I think education is important because or getting like maybe a thought-provoking prompt because you can just like make art and whatever, but when you're giving something like that, it's like, how do I convey that? That really makes you think. And I think that's what my favorite part
Yeah.
is just it's helped me figure out how I feel about certain things and be able to express that to other people and have good conversation. So that's my favorite part is the good conversations around appreciating art.
Yes, and I think education does have a duty to be liberatory because there is a movement going on right now where, people say we need to go back to the three R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and before people want to be like, well, they don't all start with an R. It's just a phrase, it's existed for a long time, whatever. Inherently, these people saying it are usually, in my opinion, wrong because education is much more complex and nuanced, and people don't realize how difficult education is, and what it's like to be a teacher. And those things are important. I'm not here to say they're not, but that creativity and ability for education to be liberatory is important, right? So we love to share the story of like Malala, who fought for education, but that was a radical act that she did, and she did it for justice. And imagine the people who are in classrooms and they don't get to be themselves, and what that looks like, which is why with my queer literature class as well, it's which I'm very grateful to teach. It's so important to have representation for all students so they feel like there is a place for them to be welcome. There's a place for them in the curriculum. We can have a balance of we get to talk about things that are not great to talk about, but we also get to talk about joy. We get to talk about liberation. And if education is this place for us to thrive, let me give you an example. So years ago, I my one of my units I do for memoir writing, I center around Inside Out. I don't think I would do it again anymore. I think I have some different ideas I want to approach with it. And we would watch TED Talks and we would reflect on them. And there's certain questions which with each of them just to get us brainstorming for what our eventual paper will be. I remember I'm in a very predominantly white district. And we watched Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Danger of a Single Story. And one of the reflection questions is like, is there a single story people have about you? What is it? And is that like an accurate portrayal of who you are? And I have students who, one of them wrote about how people assume he's Mexican and they say things about the border to him. And then, my students who go through that, my queer students, they all write about specific things, which indicate this is not a place for them to thrive. And then I remember one of my white students wrote, um, people think I'm really shy, but I'm not. I'm like, that is such a difference of what an experience in the education system is like because I was very much closeted in until I was in college. So I'm constantly battling the gay allegations and feeling uncomfortable. And I'm like hypercritical of every little thing I do because I'm so worried about how I'm perceived. And then your concern is people think you're shy. And that is a problem with education. It is not fair for a student to sit in that classroom and not ever be able to be their authentic self. And that is a problem. And every student needs to be safe. So when the people are saying we need the three R's, yes, we need reading, writing, arithmetic. We absolutely do. We also need social emotional learning. There has to be a balance because if you're at school hungry, if you're at school and you don't know where your next meal is going to be, you're being bullied for things that are outside of your control. You're being harassed because of your skin color. You're being harassed because of your physical appearance. You cannot honestly do the academics if you don't have that first. And that is a true issue. And that's why the queer literature class is so important to me and looking at queer art and all of these things, because we need to have this joy and liberatory process in education.
Yeah. In a safe space, I guess. I don't know how students feel maybe
Hmm.
outside of those space, but feel like yeah, like they can be themselves in in your classroom and
Hmm.
lifting up the marginalized voices of those queer writers. And it's very important work. So then how do you advocate for that? Because I think that if I'm assuming that's probably one of the rare classes like that in Michigan.
Yes, and it's there are some humanities-based courses, mostly in like the Detroit area, but I don't know too much about it. I also want to preface this, and this is not to throw shade at the other scholars doing amazing works, but I remember when I was writing my thesis through University of Michigan, I found there's this queer humanities course, and one of them, and it might have been the news station's fault. They were like, "Oh, this is the first of its kind." But there's a class that existed 2 years before that one with the same exact unit. So it's the first of the kind for that state, not for the country. So, you have to think about how are you telling the story. So when I went about it, if many years ago, we surveyed the students and staff on classes they wanted to see. What was the staff interested in? And for the humanities, there was a queer literature, queer humanities um, course that I had said, this is, one of my levels of expertise. I think I put a popular culture in there because my AP Lang class is kind of popular culture anyways, where at a lot of students, that was the number one choice that they're like, we want to take this course for the English classes. I didn't beat out forensic science. That's fair. I don't think that's going to beat out forensic science any day. People love true crime and forensics with that. But from there, I developed the syllabus. There is a teacher out of Massachusetts. Her name is Sarah Barbara Josh. She is amazing. She's a rock star teacher, and she's also a journalism teacher out there. And her students uncovered transphobia going on in the district and how counselors were being so horrible to these students and treating them unfairly. So she did that. She truly is the first to do this queer literature class. So in constructing this class, because the students wanted it, I just threw together a syllabus. I tied it all to standards. I laid out exactly what these lessons and assignments will be and how they're all tied to standards. And, I use hers as an inspiration. I also modeled it after my own research and understanding of things. And um, from that, we got approval from the principal, and then we got it approved by the school board. So we followed all the processes for it to happen. And I'm grateful to be in a district that's very, very supportive about it because I know there's some districts that, um, if they even saw that across their desk, they would not go about doing it. And I will say there was someone running for the Board of Education who, it's public, it's out there. He had a lot to say about me, calling me a pedophile and groomer, and he wasn't the only one, and it's really inappropriate. And that put me and my family through a lot of harassment and not a fun thing to call your family members and be like, I need you to put your social media on lockdown. I don't want you hurt or affected by this. Because all I'm doing at the end of the day is trying to build a space for people to see themselves in literature, right? We read Romeo and Juliet so frequently. A critique someone else had was like, why aren't they reading Shakespeare? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we can read Romeo and Juliet where a 15 and 13-year-old fall in love with each other and kill themselves when they can't be together. But you want to have a problem because I'm reading Aristotle and Dante, which has two high school boys who love each other. Like, what? Let's be real about the context of it. And I've seen real complaints from people, not necessarily in my district, but real people being like, well, they don't understand Shakespeare anyways. Okay, then your issue is not with the content. Because if you're saying the issue is with the content, Shakespeare has the graphic content. My God, Shakespeare actually is really graphic if you think about it. Like, that is graphic content. You have an issue with the queer identities being front and center. That is your issue. Queer people have been called a pedophile groomer um, from so far behind, but that even goes further to show my point. I have to be a strong queer person to show to them. I will not back down to this behavior that people want to throw at me. Queer literature is really important. Kids really like it. They get to see these different things, and it's just something important they need to see.
Well, with that, kind of wrapping things up, what recommendations do you have for people? Movies, books, TV shows, anything like that that you feel like would be a good kind of introduction or kind of view into some of the things you're talking about, or different things that maybe changed your life and your perspective?
I think it's important. when we think about this literacy crisis, one of the issues is we do need stuff that we're interested in reading because oftentimes we're asked to read only the classics. And again, queer people, we don't see ourselves in the curriculum. Jason Reynolds, this young adult author, um, whenever we read his book Long Way Down, I always show an interview with him where he talks about how he never he's a wonderful author, but he never read a book front to back until he was 17, I believe. 17 or 19. And I always show it because he says this argument. He's like, I was never exposed to literature that I saw myself in. And once he did that, he went back to the classics and he likes them. And he's like, it's not that Shakespeare is not important. It's that he can't be important until we can see the world around us. And it's the same with Ngozi Adichie and her TED Talk is like she did not see literature that resembled her. And that really distorts your worldview in many ways. So when I give recommendations, it's not a specific thing, but we have to find movies or books or TV shows that we feel represented in. And for me, Aristotle and Dante is a wonderful book. I love that one. Song of Achilles, I have tattooed on me. So for queer books, Aristotle and Dante, Song of Achilles is wonderful. And once you get into that, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin is beautiful. Last Night at the Telegraph Club is a wonderful book. So many good queer books out there. So you have to find something that's really good. And if we're talking about art, a book I'm going to recommend as well, Firekeeper's Daughter. I recommend that to every single person I ever meet. It's one of the best books I've ever read. The author Angeline Boulley describes it as indigenous um, Nancy Drew, and it's really, really good. Love that book, but you kind of have to find it, and it might involve some research. So those are some of the queer books that I really like. Goldie Muhammad's books talks about liberation and joy in education, and those are really important books as well. That's influenced a lot of how I want to approach education as well.
I love that. What a great way to end the podcast. And thanks for talking all about some of your hot takes, music
Hmm.
education. I feel kind of all the stuff you said at the end, I'm kind of revved up now. As your friend, I'm very proud of you for
Oh,
all
thank
of
you so much.
that.
I'm proud of you for everything you are doing as well. And I think it's important. Sorry, I'm going on another tangent. I think it's important
Like
that we all,
naturally, it's a
I
good thing.
know,
Music.
it's what I do best. I think it's important that we all give ourselves grace and recognize all the different things that we are doing, and we should say it to um each other because so often, like, okay, I'm gonna talk about myself for a moment. I recently, and I'm very grateful, I got the Bill Koenigsberg Award at NCTE for 2024, and I was named as one of the 30 under 30 by the International Literacy Association for emerging literacy scholars. And as one of my friends, Christina, did say, she's like, well, you have 2 months left. Enjoy it before you're 30. So it came right in the nick of time. But
Right.
sometimes these things that we do when I got these, like I'm very excited about it, but I'm also like, I just do these things because it's fun, but also like it feels like it's my job. So like I don't go into things like I'm gonna transform education and literacy today. I never looked at my queer literature class as this transformative liberatory thing. I was like, this is something important that I think needs to happen, and I'm going to take the charge. And oftentimes, I don't realize how important that is for other people and how they recognize that. So that's just my own story to share. Like, I have made a difference in ways that I don't. This is going to maybe be bad to say. I don't go out and do things with the intention to make a difference. I go out with the intention because I think it's the right thing. And in the same way, I want to give kudos to you because I think everything you're doing at the museum and all the educational processes and all the cool things you're doing is really eye-opening and inspiring for everyone as well. So thank you so much for what you do, and I hope you realize the impact you've had on all of us, especially me as a teacher, because I have taught your art to my class before. So
But I think it is cool, like, in English class, you're not just reading things and analyzing, just the art of word, looking at artwork and applying the same skills. And that's what I do on my field trips too. I have ELA based art museum tours. And so I think there's such a
Mhm.
connection there that just makes sense. So anyway, before we talk anymore, thank you for joining me today. Always good to chat with you about all these things. So thanks.
Of course. Of course.
Bye.
See ya.